Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith to discuss the topic of authentic beauty. And this is one topic that is particularly important in our society today because we have many many interpretations
Sure.
of beauty.
Yeah, that's right.
And so to kind of clarify particularly what the church means by this, I think it's important to discuss this. And with Dr. Smith, we will begin as usual with St. Thomas.
That's right. Always a reliable guide.
Right.
So there's a lot to say about authentic beauty. And as you say, Jason, I think in our own time, this is especially important. There's a famous 20th century art theorist named Arthur Danton. I've mentioned him before. He talks about the idea that we live in the age of what he calls the hyper-real, which sounds very strange, but there you go. Art theorists say things like this sometimes. But it actually, I think, is a good, interesting idea, namely that the representation is more important than the reality in our current culture. Now, obviously, that's a problem,
Right.
But it's a problem that needs to be addressed and thought about. And if you think about it, your internet image, right, your public representation, the way things are presented is more important in today's society than the underlying substance.
Sure.
Now, there's a variety of ways to address that problem. I think it's a misguided kind of cultural prioritization, right?
Mm-hmm.
But beauty is one way, and thinking about the way in which beauty and sight and vision all work together is a good way of talking about appropriate representations, beautiful representations, those sorts of things, right? Representations that are actually connected to something substantial and real, sort of underneath. St. Thomas ties beauty to the doctrine of the transcendental properties of being, right? So it's a lot to say, right? That's right. I don't want to get too far into all of the distinctions here. There is some dispute about whether or not beauty is, properly speaking, a transcendental or not. I don't want to get into that. But just broadly here, the idea of the transcendentals is that there are certain things that can be said of being across the categories, across the divisions. So another way of putting it is that there are certain properties that every being has just insofar as it is, insofar as it exists, insofar as it's actual. So among these are most famously beauty, truth, and goodness, right? That is that Thomas holds, as many other classical thinkers, that there's a way in which goodness and truth and beauty, as well as unity and essence, can be said of anything that exists, anything that has being, in one way or the other. So in that sense, Thomas is tying beauty to being, right, to reality. Importantly, not just representation, right? And so it's an interesting approach to beauty. It's certainly not a subjective approach to beauty because he's tying beauty to real being, right? So for St. Thomas, beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is actually is a feature of reality in a way that's similar to the way in which truth is a feature of reality and goodness is a feature of reality. So I think that in a lot of ways sort of pushes against the idea, right, that representation and reality are not tied together, right? Or shouldn't be tied together.
Right, and you see this with truth, where, well, you have your truth, I have my truth, and truth just becomes this subjective thing. And so, when we look at, say, something like relativism, many times we reduce it to simply an attack on truth. Whereas I think, we need to maybe broaden our perspective of relativism and say, well, it's an attack on all the transcendentals.
That's right, yeah. Authentic goodness, authentic love, and authentic beauty. And so I'll just read a quote here from St. Thomas about beauty and the way it's connected to being.
Yeah.
And maybe that'll give us and we can just sort of unpack that, and it'll be a good launch point for our discussion. This comes from St. Thomas's commentary on the divine names by Dionysius, later, of course, called Pseudo-Dionysius. But this is Thomas's commentary on Pseudo-Dionysius' work, The Divine Names. So I'll just read the quote. It says, everything that exists possesses beauty and goodness, since each thing is good according to its proper form. I'll read that one more time. Everything that exists possesses beauty and goodness, since each thing is good according to its proper form. So we'll work our way through this. The first phrase here is a claim that everything that exists possesses beauty and goodness. So this is a straightforward statement of St. Thomas's commitment to the transcendentals, right? Everything that exists, everything that has being, also has, to that degree, beauty and goodness. Now, in a way, that's a surprising claim, right? Because we don't think that, the table in front of me and the microphone in front of me, I wouldn't usually describe them as beautiful, right? Yeah. And we don't usually think, well, something is good to the degree to which it exists.
Right. The cockroach in my kitchen.
That's right. has no goodness.
No goodness, no beauty.
That's right.
Deserves death.
That's right. That's right. Deserves destruction. Yes. But St. Thomas is really in the mainstream of Western thought here, in thinking that that beauty and goodness do tie to being, right? And then he provides an explanation. He says, since each thing is good according to its proper form, right? So you could also add, each thing is beautiful according to its proper form. So let's think about that a little bit. Something is good or beautiful according to its proper form. One thing to keep in mind here is that St. Thomas thinks that beauty and goodness are really the same, but they differ according to a relation of reason, right? So let's think about goodness here for a minute, and then we can move over to beauty. When we think about goodness, a thing is good according to its proper form. So what do we mean by saying that something is good? Something is good insofar as it's desirable according to the kind of thing it is. So this is very controversial, of course, but St. Thomas thinks, again, this is the mainstream Western thought, that a thing is good given its species, right? So we can talk about, say, a good tomato plant. We can talk about a good oak tree. We can talk about a good wolf, right? Kind of maybe an unusual thing to talk about, but we can say such and such is a good wolf. What do we mean by that? If I said such as a good tomato plant, what do you think I mean by that?
That it has all of the things that a well-functioning tomato plant has. It has a good root system, good stem, good leaves, good fruit. All of these things.
That's right, yeah. So it's flourishing according to the kind of thing it is. Absolutely right. That's just the way St. Thomas is thinking about it, right? We say something similar about a wolf, right? A wolf can be a good wolf or a mediocre wolf. Right? Good wolves are ones that have all the right sort of bone and skeletal structure. They're effective in carrying out the life cycle of a wolf, right? All those sorts of things, right? Now, very importantly, the properties that make a tomato plant a good tomato plant and a wolf a good wolf or a man a good man aren't always the same, right? Because why? Because there's a difference in form. Does that make sense?
Right, there's a difference in nature. You actually have to, and we've talked about this before when we talk about to love. To love is to will the good of the other. You have to know what the good is. Right. In order to know what the good is, you got to know what the nature of the thing is. Right.
So you think about a tomato plant, it's desirable for it to get a certain amount of water, and to that end, you might pour water on top of it.
Right.
That's not really what's going to help a human being, right? That might give you a bath. But it's not going to actually hydrate you, right? We do need hydration's part of human flourishing, but the way in which we hydrate is different than the way in which plant life hydrates. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So there is an underlying theme here, right? That is the perfection of form, the actualization of form, the flourishing of form.
And then it's rooted in the reality of the being, not in my perception of it.
That's right.
Not in how I perceive its appearances and all those things, but in what the thing actually is.
That's right. Yeah. So I might think, sunlight is good for a plant. So what I need to do is not only have natural sunlight, but I need to put heat lamps on top of it constantly, right? And I would in fact be wrong, right? Yeah. Like, that might work under some circumstances, but not under normal circumstances. That's not actually going to help it, right? So you can be wrong about what's desirable. You might in fact think something is desirable and in fact is not. So like, you might think it's desirable to be rapaciously greedy. that's not desirable according to the kind of thing we are, according
Right.
to the kind of thing we are in terms of being social beings, in terms of being rational beings. So that's objectively bad for us,
Right.
right? So as you say, right, very important to keep in mind, right, that there is an objective basis then for talking about something being desirable
Mm-hmm.
or a course of action being desirable. Now, how does this relate to beauty? Let me just say one last thing about goodness. Then, when we're being good, that is, when we're a good man, right, is someone who is more fully actualizing his nature,
Mm-hmm.
his form. And so, in a sense, we can say he has more being, right? He has a more fulfillment or actualization of his being than, say, a mediocre man or a villainous man.
Right.
They're all three would be they're all three, Homo sapiens. They're all three human beings. They're all three part of the same species. But one of them, the villainous man is sort of suffering a privation, right? There's a sense in which non-being and nothingness sort of pervades his activities and his habits and his character. He's fractured in that way. He's deficient. Whereas the man who is a good man, right, in his being is flourishing. He's being actualized and fulfilled, right,
Mm-hmm.
as a human being. So importantly, that ties to the idea of the reality of things. With beauty, right, beauty is, as I noted earlier, St. Thomas thinks beauty and goodness are really the same in the thing.
Mm-hmm.
What they do is they differ in their relation. So goodness is related to which faculty of the soul? Goodness is related to the appetitive faculties of the soul, right? So about what's desirable. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? So something is good when it's desirable to be done, when it's the kind of thing that you should intend, you should choose, you should desire, right? Beauty is a reaction to the same underlying reality, but it concerns a different part of the human cognitive apparatus, namely the apprehensive part, which includes both sense and intellect.
Okay.
Right.
Maybe you could distinguish those two a little bit more, the
Sure.
appetitive and the apprehensive.
Yeah, so we've talked about this a little bit before when we talk about the sort of kind of Thomas's view of the human psyche. Mm-hmm. But very broadly speaking, we can distinguish certain powers of the soul. The nutritive powers, I won't get into that. Those are just the powers that help us transfer energy of one kind of thing into our own. Locomotive powers, but then really apprehensive powers and appetitive powers. So appetitive powers are the kinds of powers that involve going out towards something, desiring something, choosing something, being active towards our environment, right? So in St. Thomas, this would include both the will and the passion. So when we talked about feelings and passions, right, we talked about this some. So your will and your passions, those are your appetitive powers. And those concern the good, right? Either what is desirable according to sense or what's desirable according to intellect, right? On the other hand, when either by sense or by intellect, those are your apprehensive powers, right? You perceive something to be good, you are perceiving its beauty. All right. So Plato has a good point about this in the Republic. He says that beauty is the appearance of the good, right? Which I think is a good short formula for thinking about this. Once you realize that goodness is something objective and in being, right? Then you can come to say, well, if you think about the good as that which is desirable, so it's the fullness of being in relationship to the appetitive powers. Then once I recognize something as good, right, that recognition, the appearance of its goodness is its beauty, right? Does that make sense?
I guess you could say then that the better that a thing communicates its goodness would determine the degree of beauty.
Yeah.
If something is more beautiful, the more perfectly it communicates its own goodness.
That's right, yeah. So another way of putting that maybe is the more perfect something is, the more actualized it is, the better it is, right? The more beautiful it is. The more beautiful it is. And so I think that kind of gets at something that's both objective and fairly compelling about the beautiful, because the beautiful does sort of involve a kind of attraction, right? There's
Sure,
a pull that we feel with the beautiful, as well as a kind of delight in what is being perceived to be beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So I think that's an important part. Now, of course, we can distinguish here, and I think we should, between what's sensibly beautiful and what is, we could say, intellectually or maybe spiritually beautiful. Mm-hmm. That is, just as we can recognize goodness or the perfection of form at different levels, right? So also we can recognize beauty at different levels, mm-hmm. right? Now, the prime analogate for us, which isn't particularly moral, it's not anti-moral, but it's not moral as such, is physical beauty and physical goodness, right? And I think sometimes there's a rush to kind of skip over this, but being a good Aristotelian, St. Thomas wants to say, like, we need to start with the prime analogate. All learning begins in the senses, and what's most evident to us is physical beauty, right? Mm-hmm. And so while we can go on to talk about other forms of beauty, moral beauty, spiritual, intellectual, etc., we should still remain, our first understanding and the most evident to us, right? Maybe not in itself, but to us, is physical beauty, right? So if you think about it, then a little bit, we can say, well, what is physical beauty, mm-hmm. right? And physical beauty is the perfection of physical form, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So Thomas gives us, I'm sure you're aware of this, Jason, these three properties of beauty, right? Three characteristics. They kind of travel under different names, but we can talk about perfection. Sometimes that's called integrity. Mm-hmm. So the perfection of something, it's proportion, right? So mm-hmm. there's a kind of harmony involved in it, a consistency, as well as third, splendor or claritas, right? Mm-hmm. The clarity of the thing. So we can maybe kind of delve into those in detail here in a minute, but I want to first latch on to that first meaning of perfection, mm-hmm. right? So when you're thinking about physical beauty is the perfection of physical form. Right. It's pretty straightforwardly, right? And it's going to involve this integrity, this sense of proportion, as well as splendor. So when you think about the perfection of physical form, probably this is most recognized in sort of the classical male and female figure of classical art, mm-hmm. Where you have a sense of proportion, a perfection of form. Now, some people get really upset about this idea, but I think there's something to be said here, right? That is that there is such a thing as an actualization of form, of the physical form, right? That is proportionate, that is due to the kind of thing that a Homo sapien is. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense, right? And so I think we can talk about physical perfection, right? As something that's real. Let's take maybe a non-controversial version, right? You could think about a beautiful tree, right? If you have a tree that is very, very large, but so large that it's begun to fall over. Do you follow me, right? Yeah. Then we would say it's not really beautiful, right? It's beginning to fall over. You can see branches that are starting to crack, right? It's beginning to deteriorate despite its vast development, mm-hmm. right? It's at this point kind of overdeveloped and it's falling apart, right? Also, we could see a tree that's maybe sickly, right? That it has not developed well, right? Again, this is not a moral matter. This is a physical matter, right? And what we could say is, no, the beautiful tree is the tree that's in its initial to mid maturity, right? It's fully formed, it's complete, it has a certain proportion among the parts of it, that sort of thing, and we can say then it is a beautiful tree. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's flourishing. It's mm-hmm. not dying. It's mm-hmm. not falling over. And like you said, going back to, because beauty lies in the reality of the thing itself, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. and the perfection of the flourishment of that thing. Mm-hmm. If we were to have one of those faulty things, mm-hmm. it takes away from the perfection, or the other word that's used is integrity.
Sure.
There's something lacking in the integrity of that mm-hmm. of that tree or whatever it is mm-hmm. that we're looking at.
Sure. Yeah, and you could say, I think in works of art, right? We can see this as well, right? There's a kind of perfection of the underlying form involved. as well as these other sort of properties. The point being, right, that's all at the level of sense,
right?
And that's not bad, right? There's nothing wrong with sensible beauty, right? Sometimes people have a kind of they don't want to talk about sensible beauty, but sensible and physical beauty is a real thing, and actually, it's wonderful, right? I mean, it's wonderful that things are beautiful, right? That there are beautiful buildings, beautiful people, beautiful scenery. That's a blessing, right? I mean, it fills our life with delight and joy when we experience such things. But they are at the level of sense. Now, saying they're at the level of sense doesn't mean that the intellect's not involved. In fact, very importantly, for something to be beautiful, even at the level of sense, it has to be such that it's recognized not only by the senses, but also as the intellect.
Right.
Because the intellect, see, this is the key. The intellect is what can really perceive the perfection of form.
Right.
Your pet dog can't recognize something as beautiful.
Yeah. What?
Because it lacks intellect, right? And so you have to have intellect to pick up on beauty, because even physical beauty, because beauty, real beauty, authentic beauty, involves the perfection of form, and form is recognized by intellect.
Right, and it's important to also understand that the senses can be mistaken.
Sure.
And so that's why the formation of the intellect is so important, because it's the data that's in the intellect is what looks at and judges and evaluates what's before them. The example I always use is those survival shows that those guys go out there with a lot of data in their minds that they interpret the landscape that is around them so that they can identify the good things and the bad things. Without that, they could be mistaken simply by appearances. So very similarly, when we're looking at beauty, something can be sensed as beautiful, but that doesn't mean that it is not connected to the intellect. That doesn't mean that the intellect doesn't have a role, but the intellect does have a very important role.
Yeah, even in the sensible. In the sensible beauty, which I think is one of the things that's interesting when you think about, say, church architecture. Think about things like cathedrals, maybe even neoclassical, right?
Right.
Churches. Gothic and neoclassical are very different art styles, right? But we can recognize that they both have beauty, right, because of the integrity of form that's at work in them. Without naming names, I have been to some chapels, some churches, right, that reminded me more of a place where you would go in order to become depressed.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you were like, oh, I want to become depressed, you would go to this place, right? Maybe like a waiting room at the DMV, something like that, right? That's not the beauty of form there, right? There's a certain, I guess you could say, utility to such places, right? But they don't have the integrity of form, right?
Maybe an interesting case study would be in Gary, Indiana.
Okay. You are going to name names.
I want our listeners to maybe go look this up. There's a beautiful church in Gary, Indiana, that is completely depressed. It's the roof is missing. It's been missing for years. It's been totally weathered. There's trees and grass and everything growing inside of this huge church. But the columns are still there. Some of the stained glass is still there. All these things. So I mean, it is one of those things where looking at the characteristics that St. Thomas gives us. There's still something beautiful there, because there is, in your mind, you can kind of maybe picture it in its heyday or something like that. Yeah. And so it still has some of these pieces, but it's lacking that integrity, that fullness, that flourishing. But I think that might be a good example to go and to take a look at, because because it is one of those things where it can involve something like that. You can say, "Wow, this is beautiful," but it can also be, well, it's sad because it's lacking something. And again, I think those emotions are reactions against the reality of the thing it's not just reactions just because of my subjective dispositions,
Mm-hmm.
but because of the thing itself. Going back to what we talked about before.
That's right. Yeah.
But yeah, Gary, Indiana.
So right, yeah, that's a good example. Well, I mean, it's say there even though there is some privation, you can see the underlying structure, right? You can kind of fill in the thing, right?
Yeah.
And so there's some, I guess, some tragedy, right, to its current state of decline, right? But at the same time, decline presupposes that it was something with integrity beforehand, right? And when you really think about that integrity of form, perfection of form, if that really is the good, then beauty and goodness really are the same. Mm-hmm. And one of the pedagogical values, really, of beauty is that it teaches you to delight in the integrity of form, right? So one of the areas here that I think is significant is that Thomas also, in addition to talking about the idea of perfection, proportion, and splendor, he also talks about the idea that the beautiful is that which delights when seen, right?
Right.
So now you might say, well, does that mean anything that I delight in is beautiful? No. Right? This is a property of it. It's not the essential definition of it. But when it's seen and it delights because of the integrity of form, right? Then that's what we have as the beautiful. And so if the beautiful really is then the appearance of the good, right? The appearance of the integrity of form, then having our senses engaged with, our imagination engaged with the beautiful teaches us to delight in the perfection of form, which really is it's not sufficient by any stretch,
right? But
it is a solid step in the direction of delighting in the good, right? Delighting in what is actually virtuous. Beauty and virtue are not the same, but beauty is connected to virtue in the sense that both involve the actualization of form and perfection of form.
And I can see this, kind of when you're looking at St. Thomas's three characteristics there, that when you have this integrity and proportionality, that this third piece of clarity or splendor of form, that it really that's the piece that kind of really starts to invite the intellect into it, and and I like that word, claritas, where this and I think a good way to understand this is kind of developing a relationship with another human person. The more you kind of spend time with them, and the more that you understand who they are, you delight in their character, that it really does bring this clarity to, if they're an upstanding person and all those things. You can sense that integrity in them. You can understand it, but it also, you literally delight in their being.
Sure.
But I like that idea of clarity, that something becomes more clear.
Yeah. So I think what Thomas has in mind there, right, is the idea that there's a perfection of form, there's a sense of proportion and harmony, and then in addition to that, it's evident to the intellect. Right. That's why claritas or splendor. Right. Splendor kind of brings out the idea that there's a kind of vibrance to the thing, a kind of display of it, right? That is different than that really adds to the integrity of form, because you could have an integrity of form that's sort of beautiful in a way, like if you really work to see it, but it's not really beautiful unless it carries with it that notion of splendor, right? That it's manifest, that it's abundant, right? The kind of light metaphors are used here a lot, that it's radiant, right? Because the idea is it's manifest, right? And that's one of the reasons I think, that we want beauty often, especially associated with things that we value, say in the liturgy or in our homes or things of that nature, because when it's real, has that virtue, that character of being radiant. It shows you, right, the integrity of form, right? You really shouldn't have to argue someone into thinking that the Swiss Alps are beautiful. Yeah. If you can't see that, I would encourage you to try again, right? Now I do think that there is a a certain amount of training sometimes it goes into.
Sure. Just like the virtues.
Just like the virtues, right? In terms of being able to perceive beauty. But beauty does have that kind of radiant sense to it, to where it's a manifestation of the integrity of form.
Right. And if there is a problem, it's usually in the eye of the beholder, not in the object thing.
The thing itself. I mean, I think, this is something somewhat on the wane, but I think it's unfortunate that once you learn, I think there are forms of beauty that require a certain amount of patience.
Yeah.
Right. And for myself, I think this is true with respect to classical music.
Yeah.
Not all classical music is as beautiful as every other, but there are pieces of classical music that, particularly when you think about the work of Mozart and so forth, that I think are indisputably beautiful. You may not have the patience for it. It may be the case that you're used to a very kind of just quick and fun beat kind of music, which is fine in its own place, to be sure. But it might take some work, in other words, for you to actually acquire an ear such that you can perceive the beauty there, right?
Yeah.
But that's not a problem really with Mozart. That's a deficiency with your ear, right?
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I mean, that doesn't mean that's the only kind of music that's worth listening to, of course. But I think you get the point, right? That you do need sometimes a certain kind of cultivation. Similarly, say with poetry, right? Poetry is slow, and you have to think about it, right? And read it a certain way and acquire ear for it. Once you do, it's really manifest, right? Similar to wine. I mean, myself, I'm a steak and beer kind of guy, but I recognize that wine is better, right? It's more sophisticated. It has it demands a more delicate kind of taste. It has a greater complexity. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Or even like, if you're a chef, every chef knows, like, most people are not just born with this sophisticated palate where they can pull out the intricacies of a dish or dissect the ingredients by tasting the thing. And that's an amazing ability and stuff. But at the same time, it's something that does take that training and stuff. Now, what about the relationship then between beauty and truth? So we understand that beauty and goodness, that relationship. That beauty is that goodness being manifested. What about truth, though? Is it a different relationship? Is it similar to that of goodness, or how do we understand that?
It is similar, but I would say beauty and truth are not as closely connected. Okay. They are connected, right? They are connected through being, right? So all of these are aspects of being, aspects of reality, right? And so the true, right, is being as known by intellect. I'll say it again. I just said that really fast. The true is being as known by intellect, right? So when being is manifest in an intellect, right? When being is perceived and known by an intellect, that's when truth occurs. Okay. Beauty has a relationship to that in the sense that beauty is related to the good, right? So through and related to being. So through being, there's a connection between truth and beauty, right? The closer, the more you know a thing, right? The closer you're going to be able to come to find maybe the beauty in it. Also, the beauty of a thing might draw you into the truth of the thing, right?
It's almost like a Trinitarian.
That's right. Yeah, there is kind of there's a kind of
distinctions in relationship.
Right? And also, you can say that the true is the good of the intellect. Does that make sense? Right. So, like when the intellect reaches its actualization in the true, and so there's a way then in which truth is connected to beauty through goodness. Right. So there are these important connections. And as I indicated before, I think that that suggests an important pedagogical place for beauty in the liturgy, in education, in formation, and so forth, right?
Because, like you said,
beauty should draw us to, right, that inner reality,
Yeah, and like you said, it doesn't just, beauty's not there to just delight our senses.
That's right.
It's there, but that it actually delights the intellect.
It delights the intellect. And even in something that's sensible, it's at least a pedagogy in the perfection of form, right? Yeah. So even if we're just starting at the perfection of form at a sensible level, that's an introduction, right, into, right, the idea of the perfection of form. Like, what is it that makes that thing so attractive and so beautiful?
Yeah.
The perfection of form.
Right. So even math can be beautiful. You
Indeed.
You can have a beautiful math problem.
That's right. Logic actually could be beautiful. That's right. So there is that element there of, as I say, the pedagogical value of beauty because of the connection of beauty to truth. At the same time, I think there's a note of caution is required here as well.
Yeah.
We've been focusing on sensible beauty, and I think that's right to do so. There can be sensible beauty that doesn't line up with truth, right?
Interesting.
Maybe it lines up with truth understood in the sense of true to form at the physical level,
okay,
but not true to the full being of the thing,
or the ultimate end.
Yeah, or the ultimate end. So I can give you a very concrete example of this.
Sure.
For some reason, his name is escaping my mind, but the man who was the architect and chief of design in the Third Reich, right, was as well recognized at the time as being really a genius, and that a lot of the design work that he did in sort of the architecture of Nazi buildings and Nazi propaganda and so forth, from strictly a design, that is an aesthetic point of view, is even recognized still today, as repulsive as it is, as excellent design, right? That there's a kind of integrity of form to lots of those things, right? But of course, we would insist that Nazi ideology is completely erroneous and repulsive. So there you have a real disjunct, right? Now that's an extreme example, right?
Yeah.
We have a deeply false ideology accompanied by an attractive representation, physically speaking, right? And that's that if you feel that as being discordant, you should, right? There is something wrong about beauty being associated with error and with evil. But physical beauty can be associated with that, right? So we do need to recognize that although there is a connection between physical beauty and truth, it has its limits. That's what I want to say. It has its limits. Let me, at a less extreme level, you could say, a lot of the beauty that goes into contemporary marketing, right, that fosters vanity, insecurity, greed, and consumerism. You can make something beautiful and be creating vice,
right?
Which is unfortunate, right? Like I would say, that's not just unfortunate; it's tragic, right? Yeah. The beauty should be associated, right, with virtue, and there is a connection there. Now, our temptation might be to say, "Oh, that's not real beauty," and I want to push back and say, "No, it can be real physical beauty, right, and it be associated with evil, right, and that is discordant, right, and it should not be so." Now, what you could say is that when physical beauty is associated with things that are evil, there is a kind of privation there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So there's a lack of fullness of being there. So I will concede to that point. But we do then, I think, need to be cautious. That's all. That we don't overplay that connection.
Yeah. Well, and to look at it as a whole.
That's right.
Don't just say, well, it's beautiful. Beauty is beauty is beauty.
That's right. That's right.
But look at the whole of it. I mean, because we would say, well, humans are made in the image and likeness of God. Mm-hmm. Our human bodies are beautiful things, but pornography is not good. Therefore, there's a real disingenuous manifestation of the goodness of the human body in pornography, because there's something that is just absolutely horribly wrong about it. I don't know if that's a good example.
I can see why you would bring that up. I would tend to think that is less physical beauty and more voluptuousness or kind of salacious provocation. Which I wouldn't want to associate directly with beauty, but I can see. I mean, sometimes there's a kind of the line here isn't completely clear, right? But I think. There, I'd want to sort of say that I think there is a difference between, as I say, salacious appeal or a salacious provocation, and beauty, even at the level of sense. But you can have something that is at the level of sense, that simply appeals to vanity, right? Something that is beautiful at the level of sense, but then ends up just evoking vanity. I think that's to show that sensible beauty is not enough, right? Sensible beauty is great. It's a good thing. It's a thing to be prized and valued, but it's not sufficient on its own. As you indicated earlier, it's where we need the training of the intellect, right? Mm-hmm. So that it's broader than just the level of the aesthete, right? You don't want it to just be refined aesthetics, right? Refined aesthetics are excellent, worthy of pursuit, but not sufficient. Right. There's a wonderful example of this in Monsignor Hugh Benson's book, The Lord of the World. One of the characters in this eventually apostatizes from the Catholic Church. It's a fantastic and wild book in some ways, but it's very interesting to read. And there's this is about the kind of imaginative depiction of the Antichrist and his beginning of reign on the earth. And in this, there's a mass apostasy, and there's a priest who apostatizes eventually. But eventually, the those who are kind of following the Antichrist come up with the idea that man needs liturgy, and so they come up with an Antichrist liturgy. Right, and they come up with a liturgy to replace Christian liturgy. It's a purely secular, kind of pantheistic kind of liturgy. And the guy they put in charge of is this apostate priest. And this apostate priest is excellent at liturgy. It's all just right? It's all very beautiful, ornate, solemn, all this kind of thing, right? But of course, it's deeply wrong, right? So I think that's one literary example that stands out to me, that refined aesthetics is good, but not sufficient.
When you look at it that way, I think it shows not only something about beauty, that it isn't just this thing that delights the senses, but it also shows something about us, that we are not satisfied. Our desires are not, our deepest desires are not met with just things that are sensibly gratifying. That there's both something deeper to man, and there's also something deeper to beauty. So, Dr. Smith, you've given us a lot to think about. Any final thoughts or points you want to make maybe about beauty here?
Sure. Just kind of in the big picture, right? I think it's worth thinking about the fact that for Christians, this is true especially for Christians, but I think also according to Right Reason, that we live in a reality in which reality itself shows itself to be both true and good and beautiful. And that really should, in a lot of ways, fill us with awe, and should sort of call us to a kind of, rectitude or reverence towards being. And I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, but philosophers say strange things. But that reality, right, is shot through really with goodness and truth and beauty. It's really up to us to respond to it. And that what we need to do then is to attend to what are those foundations in reality, what are those foundations in being that really brings that about. And more than anything else, it involves the perfection of form, right? That is, having our minds attuned to the idea that there is a sort of intelligible structure to reality, that some things are objectively desirable, objectively beautiful, and objectively true. And that we as human beings find our actualization, our fulfillment, and our flourishing in responding to those objective realities.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for pointing out these particular kind of intricacies when we're looking at beauty, that we don't just accept the subjective understanding that our modern world kind of just throws on beauty or truth or goodness or any of those transcendentals or divine names, but that it's something that is really reflective of the goodness of God. But it's something that we can lose sight of, and it's something that we can live our life where we can pass over these beautiful things that God has given us, that God has placed into our care. We can easily miss them if we don't look around and if we don't see them, if we don't understand them intellectually. And so I just want to invite our listeners, the more that we can form our intellects to understand these things, the more that we can have, the divine data in our intellects to interpret reality according to the design that God has created it with. So with that, I want to thank our listeners, and in the meantime, check out our content at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.